Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to commend the senior senator from Maryland, the dean of the Women Senators, for organizing this debate today on an issue that concerns each of us, and that is the growing crisis of sexual assault in the military. Mr. President, I first raised my concern over the military's inadequate response to the growing crisis of sexual assault nearly 10 years ago. I remember it well. It was a hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2004, at which I expressed my growing alarm about the number of sexual assaults in the military and the inadequate response by the leaders of the military to provide adequate care for the survivors and to ensure appropriate punishment for the perpetrators of these reprehensible crimes. In an exchange that I had with General George Casey, I stated the military needs to be much more responsive to reports of sexual assault, particularly in the field, and to separate these women, and in some cases the male victims, from their alleged attackers. The department must also vigorously prosecute offenders and hold commanders accountable for establishing zero-tolerance policies. Mr. President, to say that General Casey's response was disappointing would be an understatement. I am convinced that if the military had heeded the concerns that I and others like Senator Mikulski raised back then, a decade ago, this terrible problem would have been addressed much sooner, saving many individuals from the trauma, the pain, and the injustice that they endured. Back then, sadly, the attitude of the high-ranking officials who were testifying at that 2004 hearing was dismissive, even though these crimes never should have occurred in the first place, traumatize the survivors, and erode the trust and discipline that are fundamental to every military unit. Thankfully, the attitude I perceive among senior military officers today is markedly different from the one that I encountered 9 years ago. The work of translating the military's stated policy of zero tolerance into reality, however, remains unfinished business. Fostering a culture of zero tolerance so that the number of assaults is greatly diminished remains a goal, not reality. And ensuring that survivors do not think twice about reporting an assault for fear of retaliation or damage to their careers is still not part of the military culture. In 2011, I joined our former colleague, John Kerry, in co-authoring the Defense Strong Act as an initial step to address this crisis. Provisions of that bill were signed into law as part of the fiscal year 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. They provide survivors of sexual assault the assistance of advocates with genuine confidentiality. They provide guaranteed access to an attorney and expedited consideration to be transferred far away from their assailant. Earlier this year, I introduced the Coast Guard Strong Act to extend these protections to Coast Guard members, and I thank Chairman Levin and Ranking Member Inhofe and Senator McCaskill for their work to include these provisions in this year's NDAA. More than anything, survivors need to have the confidence that the legal system in which they report a crime will produce a just and fair result. Based upon data from the Department of Defense's most recent sexual assault prevention and response survey, that view is not held by enough service members or survivors. As a result, I've supported and introduced legislation with Senators Gillibrand and McCaskill aimed at reducing the barriers to justice that many survivors of sexual assault currently face in the military. And I want to commend both Senator Gillibrand and Senator McCaskill for their extraordinary leadership and dedication to resolving this unacceptable problem. Let me also thank Chairman Levin and Ranking Member Inhofe for incorporating significant provisions from both bills into the NDAA. In fact, there are more than 26 provisions specifically targeting sexual assault in the military in the bill that we are debating today. For example, and there are many, but I want to highlight one because it was part of a bill that Senator McCaskill and I introduced. The legislation mandates a dishonorable discharge or dismissal for any service member convicted of sexual assault. This came from a bipartisan, bicameral bill, the Be Safe Act that I introduced with Senator McCaskill, Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas, and Congressman Mike Turner earlier this year. There are many other important provisions that are included in this bill, and I would ask unanimous consent that my full statement listing those provisions be included in the record.
Without objection.
Our work will not be complete, however, until the Pentagon has demonstrated that it is fully enforcing its stated policy of zero tolerance for sexual assault. Now, there are strong views at the Pentagon and in Congress on how best to address this issue beyond the 26 provisions in the bill before us. There is much debate on what it means for the military's unique legal system. One of the criticisms that I've heard is that we should wait a few more months for the results of still more studies, or perhaps even wait a few more years to see if recently enacted provisions have made a difference. Mr. President, I strongly disagree. How many more victims are required to suffer before we take additional action? How many more lives must be ruined before we act? Rather than waiting for the results of yet more studies, we must debate proposals to increase the confidence of survivors and increase prevention efforts now until we have proof that the military has indeed fostered a culture of zero tolerance in which survivors are no longer concerned about retaliation from their peers or even their commanders. And that is why I have decided to support Senator Gillibrand's amendment to this bill. This was not an easy decision, as there are valid arguments on both sides. But Senator Gillibrand's amendment takes aim squarely at the problem of victims failing to report sexual assaults. In my judgment, her amendment will encourage more victims to report sexual assaults, and that is absolutely critical. There can be no question, Mr. President, about the Senate's commitment to reducing the instances of sexual assault in the military and to providing appropriate care for survivors. As we debate various proposals, we are united by the need for the serious reforms that are included already in this bill and that will enhance the military's response to sexual assault And I want to thank all of those on the Armed Services Committee, particularly the two leaders, and Senator McCaskill and Senator Gillibrand for their excellent work. I am certain that our work on the NDAA will make a real difference in reducing unnecessary suffering, injury, and injustice. Thank you, Mr. President.